What if the greatest empire in the desert was never lost, but ruled by a queen history erased? The desert keeps its secrets well. Beneath its endless oceans of shifting sand, entire kingdoms have risen and vanished, their stories scattered like grains carried by the wind. Each dune is a tomb. Each gust of air whispers fragments of names that time no longer remembers. Historians fill their books with tales of Rome, Egypt, Persia, and Babylon. But beyond those familiar legends lies another empire, one that shone brighter than fire and fell deeper than shadow. A realm so magnificent, it should have been remembered forever. And yet, history silenced it. But whispers remain. Legends carried across centuries, carved faintly into stone, murmured by desert tribes when the fire burns low. They speak of golden cities glimmering like mirages, of armies whose banners lit up the horizon, of a sovereign whose will defied kings, priests, and conquerors alike. She was no ordinary ruler. She was a woman whose beauty was matched only by her resolve, whose crown weighed heavier than iron, whose gaze could command silence in a chamber filled with warlords. She became myth, prophecy, and flame. And in this retelling, she takes a form the modern world recognizes as Scarlett Johansson, reimagined not as Hollywood star, but as the forgotten empress of a kingdom buried by time. This is not the celebrity the world knows. This is Scarlett, as you have never seen her before, armored, resolute, eternal, the queen of the forgotten empire. Her story is not one of luxury and power alone. It is a story of sacrifice and betrayal, of love and war, of survival and prophecy. It is the story of a woman who stood unbroken at the edge of annihilation, who carried both crown and sword, and who refused to let her people fall quietly into history's silence. Imagine her standing atop a citadel carved from sandstone, the setting sun painting her armor with molten gold, her emerald eyes fixed on the horizon, where armies gathered like storms. Imagine her voice, not trembling but commanding, as thousands of soldiers waited for her signal to fight. Imagine a queen who dared not only to survive, but to defy destiny itself. This is the saga of an empire that should never have existed, and of a queen who refused to let it be forgotten. The empire of sand and flame. The desert was not empty. It only pretended to be. From a distance, it seemed a country of silence, endless dunes, a pale sky, the hot breath of the sun drawing a shimmer from the horizon. But if one listened with patience, the waste began to speak. Wind flowed over the ridges like a musician over strings. Grains of sand clicked and hissed as they slid into new shapes. Beetles traced calligraphy in the dust. A hawk inscribed its arc upon the air. Beneath the apparent stillness moved an unseen architecture of life, resolve, memory. The desert remembered everything. What it remembered most vividly was a city, a contradiction, an argument against nature, a miracle, Azura. It did not squat in the sand as a stubborn camp. It rose like a conviction, a thought made stone. Miles of walls, the color of baked apricot, lifted their shoulders to the sun. From afar, they looked aflame. Up close, every block bore the thumbprints of the masons who had set it into the dream. Gatehouses bristled with bronze studs. Above them hung sun-banners, panels of silk that rippled like fire, stamped with the sigil of the realm. A wheel of light over 3 dunes, the emblem of endurance. Within those walls unfolded a geography of wonder. Streets of pressed clay ran arrow-straight, then widened into markets, then blossomed into gardens cool as oases. Channels of water thieved from clandestine aquifers ran beneath footpaths, feeding basins where lily cupped the sky. Date palms and bitter orange cast a constellation of shade. Pavilions draped with indigo and saffron cloth swayed gently in the breath of the city. Fountains told stories all day silver throat, liquid language while brass censers perfumed the air with cardamom and myrrh. The markets were an empire made audible. Spices were poured in pyramids that became small mountains of color. vermilion, turmeric, lapis blue salt from a far coast, sesame the color of old page. Goldsmiths coaxed light into bracelets thin as moonbeams. Weavers called their tapestries weather, because each cloth could make you feel a season, the monsoon stitched in green, the harvest in copper, winter written in blue. Booksellers arranged codices on cedar shelves. Mathematicians argued with astronomers under awnings. Physicians bartered bitters and balm beside alchemists who collected the fatigue of the sun in flasks. But Azura was not only wealth, it was order. Sentinels in lamellar cuirasses kept cadence along the battlements, shields catching noon like mirrors. Patrols rode out at dawn with dust at their heels and returned at dusk with the day in their eyes. Reports gathered, orders memorized anew. In the outer yards, the war elephants learned the language of trumpets. Move, hold, wheel, charge. Smiths fed the fire with plumwood, tempering blades until the metal sang when stroked. Everything had purpose. Everything belonged to a design. At the center of that design stood the citadel, a hill of carved stone, stepped like a ziggurat and ringed with colonnades. The uppermost terrace bore a palace whose roofs were domed and ribbed, as if the builders had wanted to imitate the sky. Doors of cypress, bound with hammered bronze, opened on halls done in geometry and light. Star lattice filtered the sun into honeycomb shadows. Floors of polished onyx reflected walkers as if the living moved upon a second, darker world. It was here that the sovereign held court. In this epic retelling crafted as an imagined legend compliant with modern storytelling, she takes the form the world recognizes. Scarlett Johansson, re-envisioned not as a contemporary celebrity, but as the ancestral queen of the forgotten empire, the will that taught the desert to bloom. Her accession had not been inherited like a garment. It had been forged like a blade. The last king sterile of heirs, swollen with indecision, had let the realm splinter into talons. The eastern caravanners shut their gates. The river people withheld grain. The mountain forts flew their own colors and dared the plain to contradict them. Priests proclaimed portents convenient to their purses. The merchant houses weighed loyalty on scales stamped with foreign sigils. When factions met in the council hall, knives lay under carpets and cordiality was a temporary music. Into that noise she entered unarmed. Her steps were slow and measured, the measuredness of someone who had learned to make time behave. She wore travel whites, dust on the hem, a single torque at her throat. Witnesses later disagreed about the hue of her eyes emerald, river green, green with gold around the pupil, but agreed on the sensation of being looked at, the suddenness of attention, merciless and exact, and at the same time the suggestion of a shelter large enough to include you if you wished to stand there. The beautiful Scarlett Johansson as the Empress did not lecture. She located the hinge of the argument and turned it. She said that Azura was not a necklace from which jewels could be stripped at whim. It was bone, nerve, breath. You do not carve up breath, she said. You breathe together or you die by yourself. Then she left the hall before applause could become calculation. Words are tinder. Deeds are flame. The city learned her preference. She rode with the dawn patrol to the salt flats where raiders ghosted between mirage and sky and brought them into treaty by returning their dead with honors the raiders had expected to be denied. She descended to the river towns and spoke not to their aldermen, but to the fishermen whose wrists were twisted with rope scars. When grain came north again, nobody could quite say why, but they said her name as the wagons rolled. In the mountain pass, she stood where the road narrowed to a single cart and let the wind flatten her cloak while she negotiated. A season of safe passage with men who had nothing to trade but pride. She paid for it with something rare. Attention without contempt. Battle found her anyway. The first warlord to test her set iron into the plain like a storm of needles. She met him on an afternoon that had no shade. Her cuirass flashed like a struck coin. Her horse's mane drew white fire from the wind. She carried the curved sword of the Southern School, but she was not interested in spectacle. She directed the line to flex like a bow, and took the place where the bowstring bit the arrow and pulled. The warlord expected force against force. He received emptiness becoming angle, becoming collapse. His line buckled. His second fled. The dust at last belonged only to the victor's breathing. Later, when the dead had been counted and the living watered, a soldier said he had the impression that she had not fought them at all. She had fought fate and made it reconsider. Under her, Azura prospered in a way that made mathematics into music. Granaries were measured not by fullness alone, but by resilience. She ordered the construction of shadow cisterns, reservoirs listed nowhere, roofed with limestone and secrecy, a second water hidden under the first. She commissioned road shrines every 7 miles, where caravaneers could find shelter and law. Temple stipends no longer moved with rumor. They were anchored to the maintenance of schools where orphans learned letters and numbers until their names could balance accounts. She did not confuse piety with theater. She wanted outcomes. Diplomacy wore new clothes. A mariner prince from far south came smelling of salt and pepper wine. He left with a treaty that gave Azura a winter harbor and the prince 3 volumes of astronomy bound in eel skin. Envoys from the steppe arrived with falcons on their wrists and left convinced their freedom had been honored, which was true and also useful. When she accepted gifts, she did not look impressed. When she refused them, she did not look offended. She possessed that rarer power, to be unmoved without being unkind. Yet every assent lifts an opposite weight. Whispers multiplied the way locusts do, hatched in heat, devouring explanation. Merchants called her tariffs, corrections, when they worked in their favor, and tyranny, when they did not. Priests grew careful with adulation, fearing that the god who loves the sun might be jealous of the woman who used it as a seal. Some generals counted the cheers her name received and found the arithmetic intolerable. She kept ahead of it by work. There were nights she did not undress. Mornings she spoke before she had swallowed. Afternoons when quills bled sand from maps, because her finger had traced the patrol route a dozen times. Once, a chamberlain found her asleep on the floor beside an open atlas, the lamplight presenting her face as if to a painter who had not arrived. He closed the atlas and left. Loyalty can be born in many rooms. That day it was born in a doorway. Azura, an organism, learned to dream further. Mechanics tested a lift that could raise water from a hidden canal to upper gardens by the turning of oxen and gears. In trial, it groaned like a dying whale, and then, astonishingly, worked. Mathematicians attempted to factor the calendar into a new clarity and were surprised when farmers praised them. The city's musicians discovered a mode that sounded like shade. It was played at noon and no other time, and afterward people claimed to have tasted coolness. In such days bright, elaborate, confident prophecy felt like a story told to children to keep them from wandering too far from the lamp. But prophecy has the patience of stone. It began as gossip in the outskirts, a red spark over the eastern rim, no bigger than a pomegranate seed. Shepherd boys argued, then stopped arguing because the thing would not go away. Caravan guards grew quiet at their fires. A veteran drew a circle in ash and said nothing, which frightened the newest men more than anger would have. Priests prepared positions for explanations. Lovers found their quarrels paused between words, as if the sky had entered the conversation. The queen went alone to the high balcony, where the city becomes pattern and the world becomes sound. The wind bothered the torches. The torches bothered the moths. Somewhere below, a fountain explained itself to the night. She lifted her eyes and found the star, not merely red, but pulsing, as if it had a heartbeat the sky could not suppress. It did not move. It asked for nothing and gave nothing, like a creditor who has decided to wait forever. She did not cover her head or lift her hands. She measured her breath until it fell into its old habit. In the silent grammar of the moment, she recognized a sentence she had been learning all her life. Choice written as fate. She accepted the reading. Very well, she said, not to the star, not to the gods, not even to herself, but to the shape the future had taken. At dawn, she ordered the watch rotations lengthened by a fraction, the border towers rechalked for sighting angles, the granary clerks to double their audits, and report anomalies to a seal no one else used. She increased the stipends in the poorest quarter and told the city's physicians to inventory salt and vinegar. Men asked why. She said nothing. The best preparations are invisible until they look like foresight. Meanwhile, Azura kept being Azura. A troupe from the Cedar Coasts performed a play in which the sea married the wind. Children imitated it for weeks and then forgot it, as children must. A comet of bees moved as a fist over the gardens and settled in the eaves of the mint where the coiners pretended to be philosophical about it. A woman in the bread market invented a way to score loaves so the crust would sing when broken and sold twice as many. A revolution conducted with flour. Life chooses to proceed even when omens request a pause. But beneath the pageantry of days, the city's bones felt the tremor of the star. Scarlett Johansson, as the forgotten empress of a kingdom, heard it in the cadence of petitions, saw it in the ink of letters whose writers did not know they were afraid. She understood that height creates its own weather. The higher a flame climbs, the more ingenious the wind becomes. So Scarlett went out among her people, as if she were planting stakes against a storm. Not with a retinue that screamed state, but with a scribe and 2 guards who looked like uncles. She walked the pomegranate lanes and ate a fruit on the curb with a child who had been drawing suns on clay. She stood in the copper quarter, where the air shaped the tongue into a new taste, and she asked the brazier why the rivets failed in winter. "They remember water," he said, surprised to be asked. She entered the House of Widows and spoke of stipends without pity in her voice, because pity can injure. She visited the elephant yard, put her palm to the forehead of the matriarch, and closed her eyes long enough to be seen doing it. Every small ceremony taught the city to believe itself possible. Her enemies called this theater. They were correct, but they misunderstood the script. Theater becomes truth when performed without the need to be believed. Night after night, the red star, fattened like a fruit, hung too long on a bough. Priests argued over names to chain it with. Astrologers wrote tables that tamed it into mathematics, and then stared at the answers longer than they expected to. Distant lords sent envoys, pretending to congratulate, and arrived with questions that smelled of maps. The city's young whispered of glory. Its old counted jars. And still Azura burned more beautifully than any place had a right to burn. The domes caught sunset and returned it as if the city had learned to keep light. At festival, lamps drew constellations at street level, so the children walked through galaxies, as if through puddles. The queen stood on a terrace while the musicians found the nocturne that sounded like cool stone, and for a measurable moment she let her shoulders descend from their post. In that delicate gravity, she understood the secret that kings and gods most often hide from themselves, that love is not opposed to rule. It is the cause without which rule is only logistics. Love for city, people, order also makes a target. Envy is the tax on radiance. And at the edges of the lamplight, accounts were being added in a different hand. There were nights when sleep refused her. She would descend alone to the map room, where the empire was a skin of parchment pinned by brass. 1,000 roads radiated like nerves. On that surface she could place a finger and feel the phantom ache of a distant gate, a bridge, a caravan yard. She learned where neglect would metastasize, where attention would convert to loyalty, where the wind of rumor would lift and carry a lie further than a courier could ride. She adjusted the tiny ivory markers and wrote a note to herself. Trust the quiet crafts, water, bread, rumor, time. At dawn, she rode the eastern parapet while the sun rehearsed itself. The captain beside her scar across the lip, a clear way of speaking, reported that the garrisons were sound, that the watch had seen nothing but sky, that the desert was performing desert. She nodded and asked how his daughter liked the school. He swallowed, surprised. He said the girl was learning to read the stars. Teach her to read people first, the queen said, looking at the horizon. The stars are simpler. She was right. People were already reading her. To some she was a sanctified arithmetic, what you get when courage is multiplied by consequence. To others she was a problem that, once solved, would make the remainder more profitable. A few, a perilous few, experienced a quality rarer than loyalty, gratitude. They would die for her without applause, and without telling themselves a story about it. Such citizens become the nails that hold a house through a storm that would rather dismantle it. The storm would come. All storms do. But Chapter 1 belongs to the day before thunder, to the height that summons the test, to the detailing of a city so attentive to its own beauty that it has almost forgotten the physics of falling. The red star did not let it forget. Each evening it appeared at its appointed angle, a coal on the lip of heaven. It did not shout. It persisted. Persistence is a kind of speech. The queen answered not with prayers, but with provisions, not with omens, but with audits, not with a proclamation, but with a posture. Shoulders squared, gaze level, a stillness that told the city, we will not hurry into fear. And yet fear has its own legs. A certain merchant counted caravans and found every 10th missing. He said drought when he meant theft, and sent a letter to a rival to share the mistake. A priest who had enjoyed exclusive quarters in prior reigns found the new schools too full of questions. He told parables with sharp corners and watched who bled. A general competent, adored, incurious traced his finger over the cheers in a parade and misread them as a column that added to him. These would matter later. For now the city still slept like a fed animal, the gates still opened to dawn as if to a guest. The wheels still turned, the wells still answered the ropes with cool language. The queen still moved through it, with the disciplined mercy of a surgeon, cutting precisely, binding gently, instructing the tissue to remember health. On the last night of the chapter, she returned to the balcony. Below, the city performed its innumerable small salvations, bread for the widow, water for the brickmaker, a forgiven debt so that a boy could keep his tools. Above, the red star waited, neither nearer nor kinder. She stood between them, compass, weight, hinge aware that to be central is to be crushed by opposites and to accept the work anyway. The wind came up from the desert, smelling of salt that had not been there an hour before, as if the sea had considered a visit. She closed her eyes to memorize it. When she opened them, she looked once more at the star. In that gaze, there was exhaustion without surrender, love without illusion, and a decision that carried the hum of iron. We will meet what comes where it comes. Not at the gate, not in a temple. On the ground where cause becomes consequence, and the city proves itself worthy of its name. Azura shone, the queen breathed, the star burned, and somewhere beyond the last tower, a handful of horsemen shaped their silhouettes against the night and paused, not to pray, not to fear, but to measure. Men who measure are more dangerous than men who shout. The empire had reached its music. The conductor lifted her hand. The desert inhaled. The flame learned the word wind. The queen's burden. The throne did not sit in the citadel. It settled in her bones. Every morning in Azura rose with the same unblinking certainty. The sun would climb. The petitions would gather, and the queen reimagined here as Scarlett Johansson would shoulder a weight that did not decrease when shared. Power looked like gold from the street. Up close, it was iron that learned the shape of your spine. The empire's heartbeat thudded through corridors of polished stone. Sandaled feet whisked over inlaid floors. Brass hinges confessed small secrets as doors swung to admit the first wave of requests. The day began not with ceremony, but with arithmetic the kind that counts lives. 1,000 separate needs arrived braided together and expected to be untangled without breaking. Azura was bright, ordered, alive, and the price of that life was her vigilance, paid in hours she did not own. Ledger of the living. The high audience hall did not thunder with applause. It hummed with consequence. Banners of sun-thread and desert red hung from cedar beams, yet the queen's gaze slid past color and cloth to the quieter measurements, the tremor in a petitioner's hand, the way a guildmaster's eyes flickered when weights were mentioned, the hurried breath of a captain who had ridden without sleep. She weighed each detail as a coin in the balance. Petitions rose like stacked dunes. A caravan charter disputed by rival houses whose loyalty could purchase a small war. A request to divert water to a neighborhood where wells coughed dust at noon. A plea to defer military levy from a valley whose seed harvest promised next year's bread. She granted, refused, amended, delayed. She favored remedies that held beyond the hour, even if they cost her popularity in the moment. Bread was not charity. It was scaffolding for dignity. Discipline was not cruelty. It was the logic that kept mothers from burying sons. Scribes moved in her shadow like quiet tides, capturing the empire in ink. A tariff reduced to loose a bottleneck at the western gate. A grain ration increased in a quarter where rumor had begun to ferment. An old levy rewritten, so widows kept their tools when debt came calling. She spared no word, because words were the machines that lifted or crushed. The red star's pressure. Outside, the city wore noon like a crown. Above, the red star wore night like a sentence. It had gone from rumor to presence, and from presence to pressure. It did not travel. It remained, a coal set in heaven's black metal, pulsing as if the sky had learned a heartbeat. Azura became an instrument that the star played without touching. Children counted the beats in their sleep. Priests drew circles upon circles and announced interpretations whose ambition matched their temples. Astronomers triangulated, calibrated, corrected, and still could not decide if the star moved or if seeing moved inside them. Farmers stopped naming their goats after saints. Teamsters avoided whistling after dark. Candlemakers sold out at twice the price, and twice confessed at half the sincerity. The queen studied the star from the balcony, where the city's geometry became music. She did not supplicate or curse. To her, the omen was neither an insult nor a benediction. It was a measurement of resolve. In the private grammar of her discipline, she treated the star as a variable that would not change, and she changed herself around it. Preparations multiplied without spectacle. Watchtowers re-chalked a sight further by a finger's width. Spare bowstrings coiled in oilcloth under every parapet stair. A hidden ledger created sealed with a sign that only 6 eyes in the empire could recognize, tracking shadow cistern levels, salt reserves, vinegar stocks, linen, alloys, and the number of sound card wheels inside the walls. She ordered brass plates riveted to the inside of gate leaves, where fire tends to leap, and told no one why. She added 1 hour to each guard rotation, and quietly cut the court musician's stipend to pay for it. Art could weep, but walls must watch. The court of quiet knives. The palace glittered, and, like all glittering things, attracted moths that drank from the dark. The merchant conclave requested a harmless revision of transit permits that would have given them private toll gates in everything but name. The Sanctum College delivered homilies whose sentences curved toward suspicion. A general returned from inspection with reports written as praise, yet folded to hide the absence of men whose absence he had caused. In cellars beneath gracious courtyards, other meetings multiplied. A guild of scribes whose side business in rumor earned more than copying. Dock foremen who believed chains were faster than negotiation. A circle of junior priests whose hunger for relevance dressed itself as doctrine. None of them were large alone. Together they were weather. The queen felt the barometer in her tendons. She refused to rage because rage pays its bills with interest. She pried with patience instead. A bribe routed through 3 hands found a 4th hand that returned it sealed to her desk with the note, "This weight belongs on your scale." She did not applaud. She reassigned that clerk to the orphan registry, where honest arithmetic saves more lives than swords. The city below the city. When night accepted the lamps, she dismissed attendants and took the stairs that courtiers forget exist. Beneath Azura's decorum lay Azura's truth. Laundry courtyards where steam wrote temporary prayers. Stables where the breath of beasts made a fog of warmth. Bakehouses whose crust song instructed the hungry in hope. She moved through it with 2 guards who looked like uncles and a scribe who could keep a secret. In the copper quarter, heat hammered language into metal. She asked a brazier why hinges failed in winter and learned more about supply chains in 5 minutes than an hour of reports could teach. In the cloth lanes, she traced the dye on a weaver's wrist and followed the story backward through river reeds, caravan levy, bribe, bandit, drought. In the house of widows she sat, not as a spectacle of pity, but as a listening ear that turned complaint into policy. She did not throw coins. She wrote rules. The city's pulse steadied. People sleep when they believe the person at the center can hear without devouring. The cartographers of tomorrow, the map room, was her second rib cage. Here the empire became lines, and lines confessed their ambitions. She slid ivory markers along roads to simulate what rumor would do if given a market, and what panic would do if given a spark. She marked points where grain could be redirected in a single morning, where water could be rationed without riot if song leaders were present at wells, where a priest's parable could be edited by a baker's generosity. On the northern border, she placed a token, the color of debt. On the western ferry town, she placed one the color of appetite. On the south, she placed nothing, because absence sometimes tells the loudest story. Then she blew the grit off the parchment and told the night, "We will meet you with arrangement." A letter no one read, in a drawer made from cedar that remembered rain, the beautiful Scarlett Johansson, as the Empress kept a book, bound in hide, tanned with salt. In it she wrote what queens never say aloud. She wrote that every verdict steals a little breath, that mercy taught without method becomes chaos labeled kindness, that love unguarded invites assassination, but lovelessness assassinates the city more slowly and more completely. She did not ornament the sentences. Truth is already heavy. The beautiful Empress ended the entry with a plain sentence. If I must be blamed, let me be blamed for choosing the living. She closed the book, the way a physician closes a wound with clean thread. Education against eclipse. While priests argued about the star's appetite, she prepared children to outlive it. Schoolrooms were made from rooms that had been storerooms, their walls chalked with letters and numbers, and the names of constellations that keep ships honest. She insisted that daughters learn contracts and sons learn cooking. Competence breeds respect faster than law. She declared that every apprentice would spend 1 day a month in a trade, not their own potters turned water bearers, scribes turned sweepers, guards turned bakers. Empathy was scaffold, not sermon. At the spring of oracles, just a basin with tired water and old stories, she permitted one ceremony. A lantern vigil where the city sang the names of the dead, not to rouse ghosts, but to remind the living that their memory is a work, not a mood. Festivals kept the stubborn parts of a people aligned. She would not surrender the calendar to fear. Rumor, the unpaid soldier. The next pressure arrived on feet too fast for boots. Rumor that the wells of the North Quarter had gone brackish. Before scribes could sharpen phrases like isolated incident, she was at the wellhead with a plain cup. She drew water, drank, and did not die. She instructed the well-keeper to dredge silt at dawn and sent vinegar to clean the chain. She told no herald. She allowed the crowd to become her trumpet. By dusk, the panic had learned embarrassment. Rumor serves whoever feeds it first. The confessional of stone. She permitted herself one mercy, the chapel of quiet under the citadel, a space colder than the palace and kinder than its mirrors. There was no altar, only a bench. Here she measured her breath into equal parts and let the mathematics of the day dissolve. She did not negotiate with heaven. She reported. If tears came, they came like desert rain, rarely, briefly, sufficient to remind the earth that softness still exists. The whisper markets. The desert does not invent enemies. It hires them. A syndicate calling itself the Moth Circle began purchasing information with a currency that never devalued: fear. They drafted adolescents with quick legs and quicker eyes, set them to counting helmets and measuring grain shadows, trained them to fold their reports into the hems of robes. The queen met this not with spectacle, but with better wages. She built a cadre she called sand readers, recruited from washerwomen who see stains others miss, and porters who know loads by listening. She taught them to notice absence more than presence, 2 fires where there should be 3, 5 mules sweating when 6 were stabled, a priest whose shoes were too clean for a night full of counsel. They sent her a weather map of disloyalty. She did not publish it. She repositioned umbrellas. Mercy as strategy. A theft scandal cracked open in the armory. 60 arrows gone, then 60 more. The name behind the theft belonged to a boy whose father had died last winter, hauling stone for the very wall those arrows were meant to defend. Law, said Lash. Public appetite, said Lash. She counted the appetite's cost and found it exorbitant. She chose service. The boy would shape arrow shafts under a carpenter's hand until he had made 600 straight spines, 1 for each neighbor he had endangered tenfold. He would eat in the carpenter's kitchen and sleep by his hearth. The city watched. Some scoffed at softness. Most understood they had been spared a bruise that would have darkened into grievance. The armory received better shafts than it had paid for in years. The carpenter made a good man. Mercy, focused, is an investment with compound returns. The festival of 10,000 lamps, a storm of rumor predicted riot at the Lantern Festival. She scheduled it anyway. Fear must not be allowed to program the calendar. Night came velvet and deep. Then light multiplied. Small flames in clay cups set afloat on the canal until the water looked like the sky had come down to practice. The city exhaled. Under bridges, laughter behaved as if it had never met worry. On rooftops, old men leaned on old elbows and remembered younger spines. For a suspended hour, Destiny sat politely in a chair and watched the people rehearse joy. But the wind turned. A section of the press rail ill-maintained, she would discover at dawn gave way, and a small panic tried to open its mouth. Her guard looked to her. She did not shout. She lifted her palm and held it steady until a dozen captains saw it. Calm can be commanded. Ropes appeared, bodies relocated their gravity. The canal learned to be a friend again. The city survived its own abundance. The next morning carpenters replaced the rail with something that could not fail without breaking the pride of the men who had made it. A night of dust. The desert sent a test with no signature. Wind rose and did not sit. Dust arrived and refused diplomacy. Lintels breathed grit. Fountains coughed mud. The sky erased its own edges. She walked the battlements wrapped in a scarf that tasted of everything that had ever been a stone. Messengers came shrouded like rumors and reported nothing, because nobody can see in a storm. When the air thinned at last dawn revealed an inventory of what endurance looks like. Roofs that had learned to bend, markets that had learned to sleep under tables, neighbors who had found one another by counting steps and pulse. She sent lime to the wells, vinegar to the eyes, figs to the children who had not learned how to be brave yet, and permitted the city to close at noon so silence could sweep. The decree said rest, and the city obeyed because it had been taught to obey the language of care. The Vault of Oaths. In a chamber below the treasury, there was a room where oaths were stored, actual oaths, not metaphors. Tablets of fired clay stamped with fingerprints next to the words that had promised grain, service, roof repair, canal dredging, fence mending. The queen visited without retinue and touched the clay. Promises harden or they crack. You can hear the difference by tapping. She ordered one wall relayed and one oath hauled into daylight to be enforced. The man whose name was on it ran. He was found. He was set to work mending the canal he had pledged to mend 3 seasons ago. The city watched again. The lesson was not punishment, but continuity. The astronomer's honesty. The beautiful Scarlett Johansson as the Empress summoned an astronomer known to prefer truth over wages. He brought star charts, rolled like old bread, and a mind that had forgotten to fear. He did not flatter. He simply described a sky that did not respond to being named. He wrote figures, erased them, wrote others, then said the human word that keeps empires moral: uncertainty. She rewarded him with enough grain to study in peace, and a seal that told priests to leave his door alone. It is possible to build a city that allows a man to say, "I do not know," and still be fed. The sword and the loom. Scarlett did not confuse warfare with war. In a courtyard between the armory and the weaver's hall, she stood with a blade while the looms murmured. She practiced the cuts that keep a body alive and the stances that teach a line to think. Then she walked across to watch hands throw shuttles, to feel how fabric becomes counsel. Tension, release, pattern, repair. The soldiers saw her bow to women. The women saw her consult soldiers. The message traveled faster than orders. We live because we knit. The Well of Names. At the city's oldest well, where worn stone shone like an old idea polished by generations, she authorized a register. Those who wished could speak a name into the scribe's book names of the gone, the far, the never returned. It was not magic, only memory with spine. People queued with their griefs folded in palm. The well heard them and said nothing, the way stone does when it keeps faith. The red star did not dim, but fear did. The letter returned. A courier from the Northwest River posted a packet sealed with wax that smelled of cedar. Inside lay a map with the river drawn too wide and the fords labeled as if to teach invaders their business. A helpful mistake, or bait. She altered patrols by a day and a half, then sent back hospitality instead of aggression salt, bread, a pair of glass flasks that made brackish water bearable. The response returned with fewer lies folded into it. Civility is a siege engine that looks like dinner. The garden behind the wall. She kept one garden private, not to hoard beauty, but to prevent her forgetting it. No fountains, only a rill that murmured low and constant. Time in stone cracks, figs planted too close together so their leaves touched like hands returned from the same labor. Here she practiced standing still until birds forgot to fear her shadow. Here she reminded herself that rule must include spare places where nothing is asked to prove its worth. The burden enlarged, sleep frayed. Even when it came, it carried knives. Corridors without doors, a crown cracking under thumb, a city tiled with mirrors that would not reflect her face. She woke and did not scream. She simply sat and remembered every name she had spoken bread to that week until her heart resumed its pace. She did not resent the burden. Resentment corrodes precision. She simply acknowledged that weight changes the shape of a life. The trial of paper. An anonymous tract spread in the markets like cheap perfume. Sentences that suggested the gods preferred kings who listened to priests rather than queens who taught them arithmetic. The tract's author counted on vanity and ignorance to do his work. She answered with a festival of book scribes, copying histories in public squares, storytellers paid to tell tales of women who saved cities, mathematicians turning children's names into patterns and back again. The tract became a curiosity in the presence of a louder generosity. You cannot outlaw a lie. You can drown it in learning. The pilgrimage of sand. One dawn she left before the city had found its face. No trumpets. 2 riders with her, and a donkey that did not care about destiny. They traveled east to the salt pan, where the world looks unfinished. There, people swore the wind held voices if you listened until your thirst forgot you. She listened long enough to hear her own fear tell the truth, that it would outlast her if she fed it and become silent if she did not. She went home lighter by one superstition. The choice that repeats. The council returned to its favorite theater. Merchants with grass like spears. Priests with parables sharpened into needles. A general who had taught his jaw to look like competence. They demanded measures that would have made the city obedient and brittle. Curfews that would choke kitchens. Purges that would right tomorrow's riots today. Decrees that would teach children to hide. She refused the speed of cowardice. She chose to slow courage more inspectors, not more chains. More lanterns, not more locks. More names, not more numbers. The meeting ended without applause. Outside, a grandmother bought a loaf and broke it with a stranger. Inside, the queen signed an order to replace every city watchhorn with one tune to lower pitch, because panic rides high notes. Detail is the art that undoes disaster. A mercy counted twice. A thief was brought before a magistrate, then set before her not for spectacle, but because the magistrate feared his own temper. The thief had taken medicine from a temple storehouse and given it to a sick street. The queen recognized famine's arithmetic. She ordered the temple to inventory publicly and the thief to work under a physician for a season. In 3 months, infection rates fell in the quarter that had learned to trust itself again. Justice that repairs is cheaper than justice that only satisfies. Shadow on the parapet night's edge brought a figure to the eastern parapet. A letter rolled in his palm, not to surrender secrets, but to surrender doubt. A captain who had believed the tract, and seen his men fed by a decree that had carried no trumpet. He left without stating his confession aloud, because sometimes loyalty prefers to be anonymous. The queen did not intercept him. She let conscience travel without chaperone. The city acquired a soldier. It would not need to count twice. The antechamber of war. Scouts began to return with stories that rhymed poorly with peace. Torches seen where torches had no business. Animals restless in ways animals understand first. Traders who used to bargain with jokes, now bargaining with silence. She did not announce war. She prepared for weather. Grain moved from outer storehouses to inner ones. Leather workers received extra hides to repair what had not yet torn. Letters to 3 neighboring cities traveled with small gifts and shorter sentences. The red star grew fat with whatever fate eats. The city did not flinch because it had been taught not to practice flinching. The unseen farewell. There was a room where armor waited on wooden limbs. She went alone. She did not admire herself in bronze. She checked buckles the way a mother checks a fever. She lifted the sword not to feel strong, but to remember that a blade is a promise that requires a hand steady enough to keep it and humble enough to sheath it. She wrote a note and placed it under the breastplate. 3 names that meant more to her than any title, and an instruction about where the figs ripen first in spring. It was not a will. It was a continuation. The march of measured feet. When at last she rode out, the city did not erupt. It aligned. Windows leaned to watch. Bread finished its rise and became food for men who would stand long hours. Waterskins left hooks and learned straps. The army moved as if a loom had given them pattern. Drums did not threaten. They reminded spines about posture. She did not bellow. She existed in front, and existence can be in order when it is clean enough. The red star watched, unblinking. The desert pulled its cloak of dust around its shoulders and waited for the first name of the next chapter to be written. What the burden is, her burden was not simply weight. It was shape, the discipline that taught 1,000 parts to become a whole, the patience that outlived panic, the gentleness that refused to dress as weakness, the ferocity that refused to dress as spectacle. It was the art of being a person while being a symbol, and not letting either devour the other. It was endurance without applause, austerity without cruelty, love without possession, and clarity without vanity. Azura moved because she moved it. Azura rested because she permitted it. Azura believed because she believed first. Above, the red star did not blink. Below, lamps in 10,000 windows wrote their miniature constellations on stone. Between them, at the edge where promise meets peril, the queen rode forward alone in her responsibility, infinite in her effect. And the desert, which remembers everything, tilted its head to listen. A falling star. The night did not end when the torches burned low. It only sharpened. For months, the red star had glared like an open wound in the sky. Now it seemed to swell, drawing closer, heavier, as if preparing to fall. The people of Azura whispered that its descent would bring either salvation or doom. The Queen Scarlet reimagined here, not as actress, but as sovereign knew better. Stars do not save cities. Cities must save themselves. Yet even she felt the tremor in her marrow. The rumblings of war scouts had returned with stories that bore too much detail to be dismissed as rumor. Riders in iron helms patrolled the northern steppes. Smoke rose where villages should have been sleeping. River fords, once lifelines of trade, were now barricaded by sharpened stakes. Refugees poured into Azura's gates with eyes hollow from distances walked, carrying nothing but grief wrapped in rags. Each account mirrored the other. Raiders emboldened by priests of foreign lands who proclaimed the red star their herald. Warlords who claimed its glow anointed their conquest. Whispers that entire tribes had sworn themselves to the star-born destiny. Azura was no longer surrounded by neighbors. It was encircled by appetites. Scarlet charted their movements on parchment late into the night, her fingers smudged with ink, her breath tight against the silence. Each new report shifted tokens across the map until the empire looked less like a bastion and more like prey. She marked them not with despair, but with precision, as a physician marks lesions to excise. Yet the physician cannot remove disease without blood. The siege within. War begins long before the clash of swords. It begins in whispers and hunger. Inside Azura's walls, loyalty strained like a bowstring drawn too long. Grain prices crept upward despite her strict rations. Merchants hoarded spices and fabrics, waiting for scarcity to multiply their value tenfold. Priests murmured that perhaps the red star was a judgment upon a queen who dared resist destiny. And soldiers' men who had once raised their voices in her name now muttered by campfires that the queen asked too much and gave too little. Some remembered generals who promised easier glory. Scarlet countered with vigilance. She moved quietly through barracks by night, listening to their doubts, correcting them not with punishment, but with presence. She shared bread from their pot, stood watch by their side until dawn. And when the morning horn sounded, men who had nearly abandoned loyalty remembered that their queen had not. Still, doubt spread like smoke, invisible, corrosive. It coiled through alleyways and temples alike. She could not catch it all. The ambush of trust betrayal seldom announces itself with banners. It arrives as gifts. One evening, a banquet was staged by the High Council to honor the Queen's victories of the past. Music trembled from strings, wine flowed like an eager river, and the courtiers smiled too brightly. Scarlet attended, because to refuse would have been to admit fear. She lifted her goblet only when her generals did, but the taste upon her tongue burned with a bitterness no vineyard could explain. In seconds her vision blurred, her throat constricted. Poison. A hand darted to steady her loyal Captain Riss, while the hall erupted. Cups toppled, servants screamed, courtiers surged with feigned alarm. She did not collapse. Willpower forged in desert fires forced her body upright. She placed the goblet gently on the table, as if it were only poor vintage, and commanded, "Let no one leave." The physician's draft scoured the poison from her blood before it could claim her. An investigation followed. A servant had vanished. A counselor's accounts revealed foreign coin. The trail coiled outward like a snake slithering toward shadows. Yet the message had been received. Enemies did not wait beyond the walls. They supped at her table. The war without and within, the following weeks, tore the veil from rumor. From the north, iron warlords descended with siege engines dragged across the steppes. From the west, river kingdoms dammed crossings, choking Azura's lifeline of trade. From the east, desert raiders harried caravans, vanishing into dunes before retaliation could form. 3 fronts, 3 hungers, 1 city at their center. Scarlett did not retreat. She donned her armor, blackened with oil and sun, and rode at the head of her army. Her presence was both shield and banner. The people rallied. Drums beat until the air itself felt like a battlefield. Yet the cost was immediate. Border villages burned. Skirmishes left corpses unburied in sandstorms. Families wept in the gates as smoke smeared the horizon. For every victory Azura claimed, 2 new threats appeared. The battle at the Dunes of Glass. The first great clash came at the Dunes of Glass, a stretch of desert where lightning storms had fused sand into sharp crystal. The iron warlords descended in force, their armored riders glinting like shards of night. Scarlett's forces met them at dawn. Arrows sang, lances shattered, blades rang against shields until the dunes themselves seemed to scream. The queen rode at the vanguard, her sword flashing like a second sun, cutting paths through the chaos. The battle raged for hours. Horses screamed, men fell, and blood soaked into glass until it steamed under the rising heat. When at last the warlords retreated, the dunes were littered with fragments of men and metal, a mirror broken by violence. Azura had won the field, but at a cost so heavy that victory felt like debt. Rows of her soldiers lay silent, their eyes fixed forever on the star above. Scarlett dismounted, knelt among them, and placed sand across her brow. She whispered, "You will not be forgotten." Only the desert heard. The river choked, even as she buried the dead. Word arrived that the western river had been seized. The waterway that fed half of Azura was now a barricade. Barges burned, ferries overturned, trade strangled. Scarlett dispatched engineers and soldiers, but the blockade held. The city's markets felt the grip. First bread thinned, fruits vanished, spices cost 10 times their worth. Hunger sharpened tongues faster than any blade. The priests declared the famine proof of divine displeasure. In the streets, riots sparked. Bread carts were overturned, guards beaten with their own spears. The queen herself rode into the quarter on horseback, unarmed, her presence cutting through the frenzy. She commanded grain from the royal stores, distributed with her own hands, and quelled the fury for a time. But she knew famine cannot be silenced by gesture. It grows quietly, relentlessly. The circle of fire, as if borders and hunger were not enough, the desert itself conspired. Flames erupted in the eastern quarter one midnight, spreading through markets faster than water could quench. Whether sparked by raiders, rebels, or accident, none could say. Scarlett did not watch from her citadel. She ran into the smoke with her guard. Ordered cisterns opened, chains of buckets formed, roofs torn down to create fire breaks. Her voice carried above the roar, steady as stone. By dawn, the quarter was ash, hundreds dead, thousands homeless. She stood among the ruins, her armor black with soot, her hair tangled with ash, and swore aloud, "Azura shall rise again." The people cheered because they needed to. But behind their eyes lingered the same question that haunted hers. How many rises can one city endure? The shadow in the temple. The queen had enemies outside and traitors within, but perhaps the cruelest betrayal came from the temple steps. A faction of priests declared that the Red Star demanded sacrifice. They called her defiance blasphemy, her rule pride, her victories false. Crowds gathered to hear their venom, torn between loyalty and fear of divine wrath. Scarlett answered not with soldiers, but with presence. She strode into the temple during their sermon, her crown gleaming against their shadows, and spoke, "If the star demands blood, let it take mine first. But until it falls, I will guard yours." The crowd erupted not in rebellion, but in devotion. The priest's power faltered. Yet the seed of doubt had already been planted, and doubt is more fertile than faith when watered by fear. The night of daggers. Betrayal struck again when Azura slept. Knives flashed in alleys. Assassins scaled walls. One made it to the queen's chamber, steel poised above her throat. But Scarlett was not asleep. She had trained herself to rest lightly, like a soldier in enemy lands. The assassin lunged. She met him with a dagger hidden beneath her pillow. The struggle was brutal, silent, but for gasps and the tearing of cloth. When it ended, the assassin lay still, and the queen's arm dripped red, not her own. Her guard rushed in too late. Scarlett stood, dagger in hand, and said only, "They will not break us tonight." Yet even as she spoke, she knew each attempt drained strength not only from her body, but from the faith of her city. The burden grows weeks, became months. Every sunrise brought new losses, villages burned, allies betrayed, soldiers defecting. And above it all, the Red Star loomed larger, redder, a wound refusing to close. Scarlett carried the weight in silence. In private chambers, she allowed herself one cry, one tremor, before returning to the throne with a face carved from stone. Her journals filled with words no one else would read. "I am not afraid of death. I am afraid of failing them before it comes." Azura looked to her as unbreakable. Only she knew how close the cracks ran. The march into darkness. At last, the armies of the north and east converged. Siege towers rolled across the dunes, banners of foreign houses rising against the wind. The desert thundered beneath their march. Scarlett summoned her captains. "No false comfort, no soft lies. This will be our hardest stand," she told them. "If Azura falls, let it fall with fire, not silence." She mounted her steed, sword raised, armor blazing in the dying light. Behind her, tens of thousands lifted their voices. Ahead, the horizon burned with the glow of enemies. Above, the Red Star pulsed larger, lower, as if preparing at last to strike. And the queen rode forward, not as sovereign or symbol, but as burden-bearer of an empire on the edge of oblivion. The last dawn of Azura. The Red Star had grown swollen with menace. Each night it seemed lower, angrier, as though ready to press its burning body against the earth. The city of Azura felt it in its breath markets, whispered shorter. Children cried longer, and elders paused mid-sentence, searching the sky as if for a word they had forgotten. Scarlett, their queen, did not need omens to know the truth. War was no longer on the horizon. War had entered the gates. The fractured council. The council chamber once held unity, a round table where voices clashed, but always returned to the same circle. Now it felt like a theater, where every actor played to a different audience. Merchants argued that stores should be reserved for the wealthy who could sustain the city. Priests pressed for more sacrifices, their sermons sharpening into demands. Generals whispered strategies that sounded less like defense and more like bids for power should the queen fall. Scarlett presided, calm as carved stone, but she read the truth in their eyes. This was not counsel. It was rehearsal for betrayal. She adjourned the meeting with neither rage nor plea. Rage feeds traitors. Pleading starves loyalty. Instead, she wrote names into her private ledger, marking not who opposed her, but who wavered. Doubt, she knew, can be deadlier than defiance. Cracks in the walls. The outer districts of Azura were the first to feel abandonment. Patrols came late, food arrived thin, roofs shattered by storms remained unrepaired. Scarlett rode out herself to walk among them, wrapped not in finery, but in the plain cloak of a soldier. Children stared at her with hollow eyes. Mothers withered into silence. Fathers bowed not in reverence, but in exhaustion. She gave them bread, but bread was not enough. They craved belief, and belief cannot be commanded, only kindled. She touched hands, listened to grievances, and swore that Azura still breathed. But in their gaze she saw what frightened her most. Not hatred, not rebellion, but fatigue. A city does not fall from fire alone. It falls when its people tire of holding it up. The general's treachery. Among her trusted circle, one man had always stood taller, a general who had once ridden at her side through victories, who had saved her life on the field of glass dunes. Yet ambition corrodes even loyalty. When the northern warlords pressed closer, this general proposed opening the gates under truce, claiming Azura's survival required compromise. In truth, his letters intercepted by her spies showed promises of power from the enemy if he delivered the city. Scarlett confronted him not with a blade, but with silence. She allowed the evidence to speak, allowed the council to see betrayal written in ink. He was dragged away, cursing her name. Yet even in chains, his treason spread. Soldiers who loved him more than law hesitated when called to arms. One man's corruption became a crack running through the entire wall of Azura's defense. The siege of Ash. The armies came at last in thunder. From the north, towers of wood creaked forward, taller than the city gates. From the east, raiders lit fire arrows that streaked the night like falling stars of their own. From the west, the river blockade squeezed shut, sending famine into every kitchen. Azura trembled. Smoke clouded the horizon. Drums of war pounded like a second heart, and screams carried across the desert. Scarlett stood upon the walls in full armor, her crown replaced by a helmet carved with the symbol of the sun. Arrows hissed past, flames licked stone, and still she remained visible, her silhouette a pillar of defiance. To her people, she was not a woman now, but an unbroken line between survival and oblivion. Day after day, the siege gnawed. The gates held, but every defense cost lives. The walls did not collapse under stone, they collapsed under exhaustion. The city burns. The enemy needed no grand breach. Betrayal opened the way. On the seventh night, when the red star bled brightest, a section of the gate shuddered open, not broken by rams, not shattered by fire opened from within. Scarlett knew at once whose hand had turned the key. Conspirators within her own court, merchants who had traded loyalty for survival, priests who had mistaken treachery for faith. The enemy flooded in like tide through a broken dam. Streets ignited with fire, alleys screamed with steel. Citizens fled, clutching children and heirlooms, while soldiers fought in knots, defending corners until swallowed by the tide. Scarlett descended from the wall and rode into the chaos. Her sword cut a silver arc, her voice carried above the smoke. Stand for Azura. Men and women rallied, forming desperate circles of defense around her. But the fire spread too fast. Entire quarters collapsed in flame. Temples toppled, markets vanished in smoke. The city that had taken centuries to build was reduced to ash in hours. The last stand at the Square of Suns. At the heart of Azura lay the Square of Suns, where once festivals had filled the air with song. Now it became the final fortress. Scarlett gathered what remained of her army, fewer than half their strength, weary, bleeding, yet unwilling to abandon her. The enemy surged. Steel met steel, shields splintered, the square's mosaic floor cracked under the pounding of bodies. Scarlett fought at the front, her blade never faltering, her armor blackened with soot and blood. Every step she took, men and women followed. Every strike she made, others echoed. She was no longer a queen commanding. She was a warrior surviving, her body a flag that refused to fall. Yet numbers conquer courage. One by one, her defenders dropped, swallowed by waves of invaders. The circle tightened, pressed back against the temple steps. Scarlett stood tallest. Her hair clung to sweat, her breath came ragged, but her eyes blazed brighter than the star above. She raised her sword, bloodied but unbroken, and the enemy hesitated, for even surrounded, even doomed, she looked like victory incarnate. The queen's disappearance. Then came the moment the chronicles would never agree upon. Some claimed they saw her struck down by a dozen blades, her body falling upon the mosaic sun. Others swore she vanished in the smoke, spirited away by loyal guards. A few whispered she walked into the fire itself, and the flames parted around her. No one could say with certainty. When dawn came, the square of suns was a field of corpses and embers, but no body of the queen was found. Her crown lay shattered, her sword snapped, yet her figure was absent. The conquerors declared her dead. The people declared her immortal. The legend had begun. The last dawn. As the red star finally dipped behind the horizon, its light bleeding into the smoke, Azura lay in ruins. Towers crumbled, walls gutted, streets blackened. The empire of sand and flame had met its eclipse. But in every ruined quarter, whispers persisted. Survivors told of a queen who fought until the last breath, who turned squares into fortresses, who rode through fire without fear. Mothers told children that the red star had not destroyed her, it had carried her upward, waiting for the day she would return. The conquerors controlled stone and ash. Scarlet controlled memory, and memory endures longer than walls. The legacy of betrayal and courage. The story of Azura's fall was not written in ledgers or treaties. It was carved into hearts. Some remembered the traitors, spitting their names like curses. Others remembered the soldiers, chanting their valor as lullabies. But all remembered the queen, whose burden became her people's symbol, whose defiance became their hope. Even in defeat, she had not surrendered, and so the ruin was not absolute. For as long as her story was spoken, Azura breathed. The last dawn of Azura was no sunrise. It was a conflagration, a collapse, a silence heavier than stone. Yet within that silence, the queen's absence thundered louder than any victory. Empires burn, cities crumble, but legends escape the fire. And so Chapter 4 ends with Azura in ashes, the queen vanished, and the red star still watching, its judgment unfinished. The queen who time could not erase the red star sank at last, leaving behind a horizon still bruised with its glow. Azura was ash, its markets silenced, its palaces hollowed by flame. Yet the absence of the queen became a presence louder than conquest. Conquerors took the walls. Legends took the centuries. The aftermath of ash, when the invaders declared Azura their prize, they found little to claim. Towers smoldered, temples lay in ruin, and the air still smelled of burnt cedar. Loot was meager. Resistance had stripped the city of plenty before it fell. What could not be eaten or carried had been destroyed by defenders too proud to leave inheritance to enemies. The conquerors rebuilt gates with their own symbols. They stamped coins bearing foreign kings. They forced markets to speak new tariffs, new weights. Yet the people whispered names that did not appear on coins, names of the fallen, names of the defenders, the name of their vanished queen. For every banner raised above a ruined square, another was raised in memory. Invisible, the legend begins. No body had been found. No tomb had been sealed. And so stories multiplied like vines in cracked stone. One tale claimed Scarlet fell at the Square of Suns, but her spirit rose, carried on the wings of the red star itself, transformed into a guardian whose eyes still watched from heaven. Another whispered she had fled through secret tunnels beneath the citadel, biding her time until Azura's ruins called her home. Some swore that on nights when the desert wind cried like a woman, Her voice could be heard chanting, urging the living to rise again. Legends rarely require proof. They require need. And Azura needed her queen more in absence than it had in presence. Guardians of the ruins. Over years, centuries, then millennia, the ruins of Azura became a place where the faithful returned. Travelers lit lanterns at broken walls. Nomads left offerings of bread at wells gone dry. Wanderers carved suns into stone fragments, each one a prayer disguised as graffiti. Guardians arose not soldiers of empire, but keepers of story. They told children not of defeat, but of courage, not of betrayal, but of endurance. They taught that a queen who bore the weight of an empire had never truly fallen, for no grave could hold her. When raiders came to plunder relics, storms struck. When tyrants sought to erase her memory, plagues followed. Whether coincidence or consequence, the people believed the queen still defended her city, unseen but unforgotten. The song across generations. Centuries turned. Empires rose and fell around the ruins. Maps changed their borders. Rulers redrew rivers. But still the name Azura lingered in songs. Mothers lulled infants with chants of the queen's last stand. Merchants swore oaths by her memory, claiming it brought fair trade. Soldiers carved her emblem into shields, even when serving foreign kings. Poets gave her 100 titles: Flame-bearer, Last Dawn, Star to Fire, Mother of Ashes. Storytellers insisted she would return when the red star burned brightest again, not as conqueror, but as judge, weighing the hearts of all kingdoms. Every retelling bent details, yet the core remained constant. A queen who carried a burden too great for one life, and so her life extended into legend. The rediscovery. 1,000 years later, explorers crossed the desert and found the ruins half swallowed by dunes. They unearthed mosaics of suns, fragments of obsidian thrones, weapons fused by fire. Scholars argued dates, debated translations, quarreled over whether the queen was myth or monarch. But among the ruins they found one tablet unmarred by flame. Upon it was carved a single figure, a woman, crown fractured yet unbowed, standing before a star etched in red pigment that had not faded. No inscription survived, only the image. The scholars called it coincidence. The people called it proof. The eternal burden legends do not age as people do. They accumulate. Over centuries, Scarlett became not only Queen of Azura, but archetype of resistance itself. To some she was warrior, to others prophetess, to others martyr. Each age remade her in its own image, yet the essence remained. A woman who bore more than flesh, should bear and refuse to bend. Children played at being her, wooden swords flashing in dust. Rebels painted her symbol upon banners. Lovers carved her name into stone, swearing fidelity beneath the shadow of her endurance. Her burden had not ended with death or disappearance. It had only grown, becoming the weight of every generation that found in her story the courage to resist, to hope, to endure. The red star's return. Astronomers charted heavens. Priests measured omens. And once every few centuries, the red star returned to the sky, glowing faint but steady. Each time the world remembered Azura. Pilgrims walked to the ruins. Songs flared louder. Kings who feared rebellion banned her name, which only made it stronger. The people declared, when the red star burns brightest, the queen will walk again. Whether true or not, the prophecy itself became armor. In every age of oppression, her story reignited, reminding the world that empires can crumble, yet courage does not. The queen who time could not erase. The conquerors who had taken Azura vanished into dust. Their names linger only in the margins of chronicles. Their empires collapsed, their banners rotted, but the queen remained. Not in body, not in stone, but in the endless river of memory. She became more than ruler of one city. She became symbol of defiance against inevitability, proof that legends do not answer to fire, famine, or time. Scarlett Johansson, imagined as Queen of Azura, stood not only in her age, but in every age that came after. Time could burn her city, shatter her sword, erase her banners. It could not erase her, for memory is a kind of eternity. Closing of the saga. And so the story ends where stories never end, in the telling. The empire of Azura lies in ruins, swallowed by sand. The red star comes and goes, a wound in the heavens that reopens every few centuries. But the queen's burden is not buried. It is carried by every voice that remembers, every song that retells, every child that plays at her courage. The queen who bore more than mortal weight became more than mortal. She became legend. She became eternity. She became the queen who time could not erase. The empire of Azura may have turned to dust, but the queen who bore its burden remains eternal. For legends do not die. They echo through time, reminding us of courage, sacrifice, and destiny. If this story touched you, there are countless more waiting to be told. Join me on KOOL Legends, History, Stories World, where history, myth, and legend come alive. Subscribe now and walk with us into the next untold epic.